Let's get down to work. A quick structure as George Saleem, who is the Senior Vice President for National Affairs of the ADL and has been an absolutely instrumental member of the planning of this summit, is going to lead us through very quickly the core data points. Not an in-depth discussion, that will come later, but the data points about why this is an issue that is so imperative for all of us at this moment. Thereafter, we'll have an expert panel talk to us about what we know about the perpetrators of violence, how we can identify the precursors, the signs in our own lives, in our own world in advance. And then we're going to have a panel talking about the summit and the response of the summit to orient you to some of the work streams that we're working on and that we plan to work on in the year and years to come. So with that, it's my great privilege and pleasure to turn this over to George Saleem.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Laura, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you all for being here today. So the mission of this panel is to really set the scene for what we are going to embark on together, both here this morning and throughout the rest of this summit. The experts and thought leaders that are here with me this morning on this panel are going to set the scene with the data, the facts, and the statistics that underscore why we're here, and as Laura mentioned at the outset, what we're going to do moving forward. Here's a statistic to set the scene. The reason that we are all here together, that this convening has happened, is because we're all trying to figure out what to do and how to prevent what happened here, which was the deadliest attack on the American Jewish community in the history of the United States. That's the statistic that sets the scene for what brought us here. My colleagues who will follow me will share the data, facts, and statistics that affect not just the American Jewish community in the form of anti-Semitic attacks, but racial, ethnic, religious acts of bias and bigotry that affect all communities. So if you'll allow me, let me introduce my first co-panelist, Brian. Brian, can you come up and share some data with us?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here, and I actually found out about my appointment as commissioner on the new California State Commission on Hate. So we're going to utilize the talents and inspiration that we have here to bring there. Unfortunately, a DC think tank said that my appointment should send shivers down the spine of conservatives and Christians. I hope they will change their mind after hearing what I have to say. But as they say, a lie goes around the world before the truth can get its boots on. But look at the sea of helpers we have here, as envisioned by Fred Rogers. Or Roberto Clemente. This is Pittsburgh's DNA, and it is continuing that. I am so happy to be here today. You know, my father was a teenage U.S. Army American medic when he was captured by the Nazis, and he warned that if we don't stand up, violent fascism will take place. So let's go straight to the data, and just one other quick thing. I would hope that I could borrow a holy book from the Tree of Life to take my oath back in California later this week. So let's go straight to the data. If you saw Patrice's wonderful video last night, it showed this anti-immigrant rhetoric. That went up on the internet, and we saw the highest spike in anti-Latino hate crimes, indeed, that summer. So it does match out to what we're feeling. And then in the fall, not only was the Tree of Life massacre took place, but actually hate crimes against Jews peaked in November to of 2018 to one of the worst times that decade. Let's fast forward 2020. Everybody is getting this data wrong because the FBI initially made a mistake of leaving out the state of Ohio. I know you all want us to do that with regard to football, but we can't do that with regard to data. So 8,263 hate crimes. It was a 13% increase, and it was the worst since 2001. Moreover, June was the worst month for anti-black hate crime since record keeping began, and it seemed to correlate to what we were seeing online and the social justice protests. We also saw a big rise in anti-Asian. Let's go even further now. 2021, we have a bunch of data points. You can get all this stuff. Just go to @ProfLevin, my profile. The report is all there. 2021, our multi-city data showed a 29% increase across major cities, but across 19 states and DC, a 21% increase, but half of the states broke records. Moreover, anti-Asian hate crime, according to, this is our data now, increased 224%, but it also affected other groups: anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Latino, anti-gay, up over 40%, and anti-black hate crimes also rose 16% after a historical inflection point after a multi-year declines over 2 decades. All right, 2022, we have data, it's too close to call, but what I can tell you is anti-Jewish is up double digits, and anti-transgender up. So what I would just like to say is, as Fred Rogers said, look for the helpers. Our commission is inspired by the talent and soul and grace of the people here. And indeed, God bless you, I have found my helpers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George. It's wonderful to be with all of you here today. I think we've got some slides coming up. Let me just start by saying that we've seen in ISD's work a wholesale transformation of the extremist ecosystem over the past 10 years. In the place of fragmented parochial grouplets, we now see large-scale online subcultures connecting a broad church able to translate online mobilization into offline action and coalesce effectively around common political goals. This is very, very dangerous. Here, I've got, just drawing from ISD's Digital Analysis Unit, a couple of insights briefly to illustrate how we got here. Firstly, we've seen a hybridization of the threat. We can no longer talk in silos. There is clear increased interaction and mutual reinforcement between some of the more traditional hate and extremist groups and that burgeoning conspiracy space, anti-government. Of course, conspiracy, having experienced this enormous boon through COVID, expanding, if you like, the audiences for hate and extremism significantly. Authoritarian states and commercial actors, we mustn't forget, are increasingly exploiting, piggybacking off of domestic hate and conspiracy networks for profit and to sow division. We can no longer work in silos. Secondly, the hybridization is in no small function a function of online mobilization and has been hypercharged, on the one hand, by social media's patchy enforcement of their own rules on disinformation, on hate, on extremism, but also by the algorithmic amplification of content that comes closest to the red line that we've seen over and over, borderline, or what some people call gateway content. And here I've just got a couple of examples. Research we did in 2020 showed just that in 1 month, content from a number of known COVID disinformation sites were achieving 13 times the engagement rates on Facebook of the WHO and CDC combined. And we see that repeat itself, that pattern repeat itself on so many different verticals. The big lie, for instance, again, that data point down at the bottom. And so false content, extreme content, hateful content outperforms too often that which would counter it. It's not a level playing field. And what we, while we're tracking the emergence of violence across emerging and alternative platforms, we see the mainstreaming of conspiracy and division happening across mainstream platforms. The next slide, I'm just going to leave you with some of these illustrative pieces of data around the trends that we really need to be addressing. And I just point out 2 particular points here. One is that it's important to understand that violence is increasingly derived from across that broad church that I talked about, including not just from organized extremist groups. In fact, this rise of post-organizational terrorism and hate is particularly dangerous and has grave implications for response. The second is the targets are shifting. And you're right, Brian, the online tracks with the offline here. But beyond specific communities where we see an expansion of hate and impact from the online to the offline, we see now the targeting of election workers, of election infrastructure, LGBT constituencies, public officials, health workers, law enforcement, and we're going to see more of that over the period to come. So this is extremely urgent. And I will just end by saying, this isn't just about hate. We have to understand that the mainstreaming of extremism and hate have a systemic impact on democratic civic culture and process. Our work together here couldn't be more urgent.
Thank you. My name is Liz Yates. I'm the senior researcher for anti-Semitism and human rights first on our new extremism and human rights team. And I'm here speaking to you today because as human rights advocates, we see the hate and extremism that we're talking about today as the preeminent threat to migrants, immigrants, minority communities, and to so many people around the world. So the trend that I want to talk to you about today that we're very concerned about is the reality that elements of extremist movements are being harnessed by mainstream actors so successfully that they now pose a very real threat to our democracy and, of course, our ability to work for a more just, pluralist, and safe society. So we see this acutely in contemporary efforts to mobilize election denial, and I'm just going to give you two examples of extremist movements that have been mobilized this way. The first, QAnon, as I'm sure you know, conspiratorial, highly anti-Semitic movement. Today, QAnon is very focused on election integrity. For instance, one well-known Q influencer who, as a relevant aside, has promoted the anti-Semitic idea that the Titanic was intentionally sunk in a financial scheme, this man has formed an organization to support election-denying candidates for Secretary of State because he knows that this is a role that will have a lot of power over state elections. And this organization has been successful. Of the 12 election-denying candidates on the ballot in November, 5 of them are associated with this Q-influenced organization. But Q is only one example, of course, of this trend. HRF's extremism program is also analyzing the narratives and actions of prominent mainstream actors who are trafficking in nativist rhetoric, where we also see increasing visibility of anti-democratic themes. Obviously, the increasingly popular mainstream version of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory targets elections directly, claiming that immigrants are pawns in a partisan scheme to, quote, replace current voters that has a direct impact on our narratives about democracy and elections in this country. Of course, it's not just rhetoric. Last week, one of the most active elective denial organizations in the country hosted a summit in Houston where rather than focusing on their more common work, which is to continue to deny the results of the 2020 election. Instead, they focused all of their efforts that day on portraying migrants on the border as an invasion, quote. So as these examples illustrate, the hate and anxiety that have propelled so many extremist movements is being funneled directly into acute attacks on our democratic infrastructure. So thus posing an existential threat to the rights and freedoms of peoples around the world. At HRF, we are deeply committed to countering this threat, and we look forward to building and expanding partnerships with many of you. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Katrina Doxey, and I would like to share a few of the top-line findings from the analysis that my team at the Center for Strategic and International Studies has done looking at the increase in domestic terrorism attacks and plots in the United States. Our team has compiled a data set dating back to 1994, which tracks the number of attacks and plots, as well as key variables, both about the incidents and about the perpetrators. We've seen, as you can see in this graphic, that there has been a notable increase in the number of attacks and plots in recent years, beginning in about 2014. This has culminated in historic high levels of domestic terrorism in the United States in 2020, where we saw the largest number of incidents since the data set began, with 110 attacks and plots, and in 2021, with the second highest level. Our data has shown that the majority of these incidents have been committed by individuals with violent far-right ideologies, including white supremacists, and anti-government extremists, including militia members and individuals motivated by many of the conspiracy theories that my colleagues on this panel have already discussed. In 2020, 2/3 of incidents were committed by violent far-right individuals, and in 2021, roughly half were committed by individuals on the violent far-right. In 2021, however, we also saw a growing number of incidents committed by individuals with violent far-left ideologies. And we have increasingly seen tensions between ideologies playing out, including in the streets of America. Our data also found that a growing percentage of incidents, particularly in 2020 and 2021, occurred in the context of demonstrations, including protests and rallies. This includes incidents that were committed by protesters, incidents that targeted protesters, and attacks that were timed to occur alongside demonstrations so as to maximize impact. This has created a security dilemma of sorts between extremists of differing ideologies in the United States and calls for immediate attention. In addition to these trends, a few others I'd like to highlight that I think the various panels over the next few days will address include: over the past few years, there's been an increasing percentage of terrorist attacks and plots in the United States committed by individuals with current or past affiliation with the military or law enforcement. Second, regardless of ideology, the most frequent target of terrorist attacks and plots in the United States have been government, military, and police personnel and locations, with the next most frequent among violent far-right perpetrators being individuals targeted on the basis of their identity, including their racial, ethnic, gender, or sexuality, as well as religion. And finally, I would like to highlight that regardless of perpetrator ideology, the majority of terrorist attacks that resulted in fatalities in the United States have been committed with firearms, calling for immediate attention, particularly with firearms present at many of those demonstrations I mentioned previously. I look forward to discussing these issues and solutions with all of you over the coming days. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Mary McCord, and I'm a former federal prosecutor, former Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice, and I now lead the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law. I don't do data, I sue militias. Though traditionally anti-government, militias have increasingly allied with white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and other extremists. We saw this at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. We saw this in the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. But post-January 6th, the strategy for spreading hate and intimidation and destabilizing democracy is now become decentralized. I want to read to you the description posted by extremist social media platform Gab this past May. This is their words. Focus on county over country. Capture your local county, then several of them, then maybe your state. What we need is a decentralized and localized Christian political movement. Now, we've seen this play out across the country. Extremists and election deniers threatening local officials, school board members, teachers, public health officials, election officials, driving them from office and in many cases taking their positions. Unlawful private militia members are volunteering as poll workers because, in their words, we need to be at every polling station and have eyes and truth-telling patriots monitoring on the ground. We've seen threats against candidates of both parties running for offices, an effigy hung in one's yard, another shot with a BB gun while putting out signs, another had a dog sicked on her while canvassing. And we've seen the new constitutional sheriffs movement, and yes, I'm using air quotes there. This is a fringe movement of sheriffs that believe they answer to no higher authority than the US Constitution as they interpret it. They refuse to enforce gun regulations. They're rabidly anti-immigrant. They're anti-government. And they have now formed an alliance with election deniers in an effort to, again, their words, have real-time eyes on voting in their counties. Militias are taking note. in some cases forming reserve teams, including right here in Pennsylvania, and calling on sheriffs to deputize them. These are just some of the threats we face.
Good morning. My name is Bjorn Eiler, and I'm the co-founder of the Khalifa Eiler Institute and Glitter Pill. I arrived here in the United States from Norway on 9/11, which is a symbolic date for someone in our field to be flying into New York for sure. But it's also the day that was marked by an unprecedented election back home in Sweden, where I live. The Sweden Democrats, a party despite their name, has deep roots in the neo-Nazi movement and strong ties to the movement still. They won 20.5% of the vote, which makes it the second largest party in the country, and gives it 73 seats in parliament, which is 11 more than in the last cycle. This growth of what I call Nazis in suits, far-right extremists exploiting our democracies to gain power, to undermine democratic values, poses a great threat to democracy, to our institutions, and to our fundamental rights, not only here in the US, but around the planet. We expect this field to be nonpartisan, and we can hopefully come together across divides to address the important issues of hate, but I think it's at the same time important to also acknowledge that hate, violent extremism, and the rhetoric surrounding this has been gamified, has been used, has been abused by neo-Nazis in suits in order to take over our democratic system. This poses a great threat, and so our efforts to map this internationally is something that we have done to reveal not only the behaviors, but also the networks behind this. We're seeing an interplay not only between political parties that are collaborating across or through kind of diplomatic affairs, but also interplay between political parties and basically street gangs, street fighters. We're seeing essentially militia groups serve as defense, as protection for candidates. We've seen people execute acts of violence that undermine the institutions of elections, as has been already stated. We are, however, not only seeing this within nations, we're seeing it across nations. We're seeing it be an interplay between what's happening in Europe, what's happening here. We're seeing an interplay between what's happening here, what's happening in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, etc. There's so many countries that see this phenomenon of white supremacy. However, the issue of hate goes beyond that. We see it play out in Indian politics. We see it play out in Pakistan. We see it play out in Poland and Hungary, etc. And so it becomes important to acknowledge that this is not only a domestic issue, it is an international issue. We also see that the interplay does not happen only online. We tend to focus a lot on the online aspect of conferences like this, at least the ones I go to. And so it's important to acknowledge that these also happen in person. With the war breaking out or escalating in Ukraine this year, we've seen groups go off to get military experience, essentially. What will happen when those fighters come back to their respective European countries or other countries is at this point unknown, but we'll probably see something akin to what we feared would happen with the returns of ISIS fighters just a few years ago. In our work to map extremism, we build on the fundamental definition of violent extremism as the violent denial of diversity. The violent denial of diversity is a global phenomenon that reaches beyond religion, race, and creed. As we saw, ISIS wants to eradicate those who do not follow their interpretation of Islam. White supremacists want to eradicate those who they view not to be white. Anti-Semites want to eradicate the Jewish population. Most of the time, extremists in their hate seek to eradicate multiple groups at the same time. And in this dynamic of the nebulous interplay between ideologies and groups, we see that hate becomes in itself an identity that transcends ideology. Our response to this must be to eradicate hate, and so great to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brett Kubicek. I manage research for something called the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. We're the Government of Canada's main program to try and support and inform, help grow and develop frontline efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism in all of its relevant forms, including hate-motivated varieties, where the focus is really on upstream prevention against the more extreme forms of violence in these categories. Our work is complementary to work by law enforcement, national security, but distinct from it. And while we look to much of the same data, some of the hate crime data, the online data that you've heard about already, for us it's really important to see how the different trends and factors are playing out at a very local level for specific people in specific places and times to help inform effective prevention. So for us, a lot of the really important information, data, evidence, lessons comes from the small but growing number of frontline professional programs that work with cases of complex risk, need, and vulnerability. And fortunately for us, and for you, I hope, a lot of the main programs in Canada are here at the summit. The British Columbia government's SHIFT program, the Organization for the Prevention of Violence from Edmonton, Yorktown Family Services from Toronto, John Howard Society of Ottawa, the Prevention Clinic from Montreal. So I'm going to they can speak to their experiences much better than I can, but I want to give you 6 quick, I promise George, quick types of information that are informing our work in the Government of Canada. First, case numbers are up. Most of these programs are under significant pressure in terms of the number of cases that they're dealing with. Second, similar to the recent public threat reports by our domestic intelligence agency, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the kinds of cases they're seeing are somewhat similar. There's ongoing concerns about groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh or ISIS, but a lot of the focus is on the kinds of movements, milieus mentioned here, white supremacy, neo-Nazi type groups, anti-authority, anti-government, violent and misogynist. We often use the umbrella category of ideologically motivated violent extremism, but it's also about hybrids. Both our intel folks, but also the frontline prevention practitioners see common cause amongst some more in sort of ISIS milieus with white nationalists, targeting, as we've heard, their targets are anti-Semitic, trans and homophobic, misogynist, anti-government, anti-authority. Third, early prevention efforts, somewhat similar to crime prevention, were often about the typical age crime curve, looking at late adolescent, early adults. In Canada and other countries, the cases that some of these programs are seeing are both skewing younger and disturbingly younger, as well as quite a bit older. Fourth, for understanding pathways to try and figure out what is driving people, leading them towards involvement in violent extremism, and we will hear more for sure, but I've been struck by how some of the frontline programs talk about layers of vulnerability, not just at the individual level, but for their family and social circle, and we will hear more about that. Fifth, in context of those different vulnerabilities, ideology is not always the main driver, leading people towards violence. There's an element of a good news story there, that if you treat some of the key other vulnerabilities, there's evidence that the risk of serious violence reduces. Last point though, a number of these programs have an ongoing concern. Even if the violence reduction is reduced, the grievances, the buying in of conspiracy theories, some of the ideological problematic trends don't necessarily reduce, and that's in a context of all these factors being at a scale, a level of exposure, including online, that are of significant concern. And it's one of the important reasons why for us having those local frontline programs also connect with some of the wider sort of early prevention initiatives or other researchers that we hear about to figure out how this all fits together is super important. Thank you.
Good morning and thank you. My name is Louisa Klingvall. I work for the European Commission, the Department, the Directorate General for Justice, and I work in a team that looks at the whole enforcement chain for our European laws to tackle hate crime and hate speech, and more specifically racist and xenophobic hate crime and hate speech. So just as we've heard from the other speakers today, I mean, hate speech has been a continued and growing problem in Europe since the millennium shift. And it seems to spike every time our societies are put under stress. So we have seen it in the migration crisis, we saw it during the pandemic, and of course we see it now in the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And of course, hate speech online is a major concern because, of course, this is where it's allowed to spread. So what are we doing about it? I think since last year, the EU legislator has reached a political agreement on the Digital Service Act. And this very much represents an unprecedented set of new enforceable rules that will require accountability for online platforms for illegal content that they host. And that includes, of course, illegal hate speech that incites to violence and hatred. However, beyond requiring the platforms to deal with hate speech when they find it, the Digital Service Act also recognizes the role of the new town square of some of these largest platforms. This is where today's democratic discourse happen. So to deal with the role of the platforms, the very large ones for democracy, these new rules will require the very large platforms, so the ones that have more than 45 million users in the European Union, to assess and mitigate systemic risks on their platforms. And those risks would typically include the spread of, for instance, hate speech, but also systemic risks to fundamental rights of the users of the platforms, their right to freedom of expression. It will also allow for the establishment of a crisis response mechanism that could also help to deal with emerging and very serious threats, such as wars and pandemics that affect public security and public health. But regulation is not enough. We really have to continue with a collaborative approach between the IT platforms, our member states, the enforcement authorities, and civil society. So we will continue and ramp up the work that we do on the Code of Conduct on countering illegal hate speech in Europe, to ensure effective measures against illegal hate speech, but also to foster fundamental rights and freedom of expression online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louisa. So, friends, we've heard from leading academic researchers, we've heard from civil society organizations, non-for-profit organizations, we've heard from government representatives, and we've heard from the European Union. And our last speaker here will be a representative from Facebook, who I believe is joining us virtually. Let's cue it. Thank you. Perfect. Dina, over to you.
Hey, George. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody in the audience, to you and to Laura for the... I just wanted to start off by saying that seeing the number of experts in the room and seeing the outstanding list of participants, I'm really truly humbled and very honored to join you. As George mentioned, I'm Dina Hassin. I lead Meta's counterterrorism and dangerous orgs work on policy development and expert partnerships, looking specifically at the issues around hateful organizations, terrorist organizations. And the trends that I wanted to discuss from our side today are really threefold. The first is the concept of looking at content and the space that we're moving into beyond just content, into things that are categorized under behavior. So when we initially started to do this work, we really were focused to the points being made earlier around the most harmful kinds of content that we were seeing online coming from organizations like Daesh, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. And as we've seen these last few years, there's been an evolution that we've noticed. And so we're now trying to look at and learn from the experts and understand how behaviors really are manifesting online that we should be considering and what might be harmful there. That's the first portion of this, which is the content versus behavior. The second portion of this, and Sasha touched on that very eloquently earlier on, is the decentralization of these organizations. Far away are the days of just a clear structure of command and control for all the organizations we are dealing with online. It's become a lot more difficult to understand and tackle them because they're no longer clearly logoed. There is not the same symbol that's being shared. So finding this and tracking this kind of content down is becoming more difficult. It's why it's so essential to work with the communities and the experts that are in the room with you today. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we are tackling this kind of mutation. And then finally, I really wanted to highlight that we're trying to go beyond just the removal of the content and the work around policies that simply look at downstream's impact of this kind of content. We're trying to address this more holistically through prevention work with many of the partners in the room that I'm honored to have been partnered with in our programs at Meta. But we look at prevention, removal, reduction of harmful content, and investing in research so we can understand this threat more accurately and be able to understand from the community in the room. And so I'm going to leave it there because I'm really keen to hear more from the experts on this panel just as much as share our insights. But again, I'm truly honored and humbled. And I'm so sorry I couldn't join you in person. A few things have happened in the UK that have made that a little challenging. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you for joining us virtually. Friends, please join my panel in giving us a round of applause. Thank you.